Hello, Dan Alasso, making history once again. It's a rainy and kind of chilly day in northern Minnesota, so I'm bundled up here in my office, and I want to kind of go through a conversation that I had once again with Grok. This time related to my book that I wrote about 10 years ago now about the doctor in Massachusetts, Charles Knowlton. And this is a nonfiction biography. Runs to about 230 pages of narration and then about 30 pages of notes. And despite all of that, it comes out to only about a 1 megabyte Microsoft Word file. So I took that file, and after getting an acknowledgement from Grok 4, which I bought a 1-month subscription to just to test it out, I got it to acknowledge and to show me in its documentation that it does not use any user content as training material. So I basically got the assurance that if I uploaded this, it wouldn't become part of its training data. So this would remain my property. So I think I believe it on that issue, and so what I've done is I have uploaded it, and I said to Grok 4, which I just upgraded to this morning, I'm considering rewriting this nonfiction book as a historical novel. Please take a look and make suggestions on the best way to go about this. And so it thought for all of 12 seconds, and it said, below I'll provide structured suggestions for rewriting Dan Alasso's nonfiction biography of Charles Knowlton as a historical novel. This transformation can make the story more engaging and accessible to a broader audience, emphasizing drama, emotion, and narrative flow while preserving the core historical facts. I do think that it has some drama and some narrative flow as it is in the biography form, but I take its point that there are historical novels that have more narrative intensity than my nonfiction work. And it gave a couple of examples, and then it gave me some things to think about as I was going into this process, defining my vision and my goals about genre, tone, audience, themes, and also it suggested that a novelization of this should be probably about twice as long as the thing itself. So that was an interesting suggestion. It told me some things kind of that it could do for me by way of research and preparation. It talked a little bit about structural changes, narrative, pacing, plot arcs, that sort of thing. It suggested that it could help me enhance the fiction elements, the dialogue, right? Because dialogue doesn't exist in nonfiction unless you actually have an account of two people talking that someone else documented. And then, of course, the interior monologues and the interior thoughts and emotions of people are oftentimes also missing from nonfiction. So it had some things to say about that, about some sensory and setting elements, about characters, and how I might portray them. And it did suggest that I humanize the antagonists a little bit, which I thought was interesting. Talked about humor and horror. Those were words that I used in my descriptions, so it sort of picked up on that as well. And then talked about the writing process and then the tools that I could use that it could help me to use. And so that was really kind of interesting as well. And I said, that sounds like a good plan. And I asked it to try rewriting the first chapter of the biography as a novelization, adding dialogue between Charles and his parents and possibly even his brothers. And so it did that. And it thought for 12 seconds once again, and it came up with something. It isn't bad. It's not exactly what I would write, but it incorporates a lot of the descriptions and the ideas that I had put in there. It invents a character, his older brother, Ezekiel. Ezekiel was not his older brother's name. His grandfather was named Ezekiel, however, so Grok didn't come up with that just out of completely thin air. which is interesting. And so it creates a little bit of dialogue between this imaginary brother and Charles, and then some more dialogue between Charles and his parents. It gives his parents sort of the right type of tone, and it puts the right kinds of words in their mouths, I thought, based on the fact that I had described them as very dour Puritans. And so that was interesting as well. It does incorporate references to Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the Age of Reason in this chapter, which I might not do. I might hang on to that for a little bit later. But I thought it was a pretty good first stab at dramatization of that first chapter that I'd written. But then I changed course, and I said that it had said that it could explore free thought networks using some keyword searches on X, formerly Twitter. And so I said, can you help do that? And it thought about that for 42 seconds and did a bunch of searches to explore contemporary free thought networks, and also to explore the American Antiquarian Society, where I spent a lot of time myself researching when I was in New England, because it's in Worcester, Massachusetts. And so it gave me some thoughts about free thought organizations and about the Free Thought History Festival, which included a bunch of references. So that was kind of interesting. And then it talked about the things that are in the archive and the stuff that the American Antiquarian Society focuses on, with, again, a bunch of references. So that was kind of cool. And then there were 9 X posts that it used as its sources and 11 web pages. And I can always go to the web pages and check them out. And I did that in the case of this Puritan Counter-Reformation article. I went to the article, I downloaded it, and then actually I went back in and I plugged it in, and I said, here it is. I said, please summarize this article with special attention to the ideas that would be relevant to free thought as developed by Charles Knowlton, because the article itself, as you can see, is almost 30 pages long. So I didn't want to read it. I wanted Grok to tell me what it said. And it did a pretty good job of that. It talked about the comparison that the author Green made between the Catholic Counter-Reformation after the Protestant Reformation began in the early 1500s and this new Puritan Counter-Reformation that was responding to challenges like Unitarianism in New England. It didn't respond all the way to atheism or free thought, or what they called infidelity at the time. And so I asked, after reading all of this that Grok came up with, which was a pretty good summary, I said, authors like Green tend to focus on movements like Unitarianism, which pull people closer to, but not all the way to, infidelity. So can we assume, or can we conclude that the things that Green talks about also apply to full-on freethinkers? And I asked it to cite some sources, and it thought about this for 51 seconds. And it kind of came back with an agreement with me that it thought that this could be applied, that the ideas that Green finds in this Counter-Reformation could be applied all the way to free thought, which I think was very much in the minds of especially the Puritans and the hardcore fundamentalist Calvinists of the time, because they thought that Unitarianism was a drift on the way to infidelity. And so that was interesting. It cited 30 more web pages that I can go to. And one thing that I would say about this is that I'm going to have to spend a lot of time, if I do research like this, kind of pouring through the things that it comes up with. Now, I will be able to take other articles and download them and add them back into Grok, post them back into Grok, and ask Grok to do a little bit of this heavy lifting for me. So I'm not going to have to read 30 articles on this topic in order to get a little bit more out of it. So that's going to be useful to me as well. And then it provides a bunch of books and articles and blog posts and another bunch of web pages. Then I asked it because I've been very aware that there is this community of freethinkers in the early 19th century. I asked Grok about documentation concerning personal connections and friendships between Charles Knowlton and either Robert Dale Owen or Frances Wright. I suggested to it that I believed that they were personally acquainted and had met on several occasions. And then additionally, I speculated that Knowlton and Owen had collaborated on their contraceptive writings. And for this one, it had to think for over 2 minutes. So 142 seconds later, it came up with, yes, several publications do document a personal connection between Charles Knowlton and Robert Dale Owen. Shared speaking platforms, mutual promotion of works, and being at the same events, especially free thought conventions and that sort of thing. And there's also evidence that Knowlton was at several places that were associated with Frances Wright, probably when she was there as well. And so it summarizes a bunch of those, again, giving a bunch of really useful links and citations. And then it responded to my speculation by saying that there are no confirming sources that show joint authorship or direct collaboration on these things. It found that Knowlton referenced Owen, but this was portrayed as inspiration rather than partnership. And it didn't find that Owen used Knowlton's works. And once again, it had a bunch of sources for its conclusions, which was very useful, and which I have yet to really delve through each of them one by one. But I did ask it, just to keep the conversation going, what do you make then of the later edition of Moral Physiology that bears the author credit of by a physician rather than Owen's own name? Because Owen wasn't a doctor, but his friend Knowlton was. And it thought for, again, over 2 minutes and gave me kind of an equivocal answer. And this is interesting because I had mentioned last time that I thought that Grok 3, which I used as the basis for my previous post, was very agreeable and was sort of just buttering me up and telling me, oh, you're so smart, and reiterating the things that I had said in slightly different words, because who doesn't like it when their ideas are parroted back to them with agreement? This is a little bit more critical, though. In this case, I think Grok 4 was beginning to disagree with me and was finding some things that don't lead directly to my conclusion that I think, and I still do think, that Knowlton and Owen probably talked about their works. Because it's not able to find any conclusive evidence where one or the other of them says, yes, I worked with the other person in order to develop these ideas. It does consider the alternate explanation of piracy, which I don't agree with, although it is worth considering, I suppose. And once again, it gives 43 different citations. So, very, very useful. I said to it, those are good points, but in addition to the by a physician attribution in some editions of Owen's book, there are details that align with Knowlton's original medical contraceptive methods, which Owen wouldn't have been able to come up with on his own. And it thought for a minute and a half on this, and it said it was unable to find the similar medical procedures that I was alluding to in the Owen text, because what it was able to find in digital forms that it could read were the original 1831 Owen edition, one of the By a Physician editions dated in 1836, and then some later editions dated 1847 and 1875, which were edited by a different doctor named Ralph Glover. And so it found no real evidence for a connection. One thing that I would say about that is that I had access at the American Antiquarian Society to more editions of both The Fruits of Philosophy and Moral Physiology, which Grok didn't have access to because they hadn't been digitized. They were just available in the original forms. They have a lot of really cool old books at the Antiquarian Society. So I was able to do a side-by-side comparison, and I was able to find some things that I thought were very much reminiscent of Knowlton's methods in Owen's book. So I'm still holding to that based on evidence that I have that Grok didn't have. And so it came up with 71 references for this. And I think that there will probably be some really interesting stuff in there that I haven't had a chance to find yet. So this is going to be very valuable to me. So I congratulated it, and then I asked it, does Owen ever mention Knowlton in any writing that you can find? And I had never found any writing myself in which Owen mentioned Knowlton. And I had access, again, probably to more things than Grok does, because I actually got my hands on and scanned the entire run of Robert Dale Owen and Francis Wright's Free Inquiry. And I haven't read them all yet, but in none of them does he specifically mention Charles Knowlton as a person that he knows, although, of course, the Free Inquirer does advertise Knowlton's books. And Grok agreed with me on that, and Grok wasn't able to find anything that I wasn't aware of already written by Robert Dale Owen, in which he does say something about Knowlton, which, of course, was entirely possible. Just because I'm a human researcher and I've got access to things that aren't digitized doesn't mean that I'm aware of all the things that have been digitized. And so that is one of the things that I continue to be curious about. And so I once again asked it, do any contemporary newspapers that you can access mention Knowlton, particularly his two books, Elements of Modern Materialism or Fruits of Philosophy? And it says, yes, there are several, and it gives some examples of them. Most of the examples that it gives are positive mentions. And so I asked, are there any adversarial depictions? And it thought about this for, again, about another minute and a half, and it came up with a couple. Most of them, once again, are free thought papers that are responding to attacks, and some of which even contain attacks, because there were some defenders of the faith who would write letters to the editor of papers like the Boston Investigator, and a pretty lively controversy would be kept up in those editorial pages. So it gave me some other few dozen web pages to look at, and I'm sure I'm going to find things that I'm not aware of in there. And then I asked, because we had been sort of talking about the Elements of Modern Materialism, Knowlton's 1829 book, and I do know that it's available fully online in the Internet Archive, I asked, what is your assessment of modern materialism? And it thought about this for nearly 3 minutes. And then it said, as Grok, my assessment of modern materialism, Charles Knowlton's philosophical treatise arguing for a materialist worldview without immaterial souls or divine intervention, is that it's a bold, pioneering work in early 19th century American free thought, blending empiricism, utilitarianism, and social reform in a way that anticipates later secular humanism. It gave some more details. It cited a dissertation, which probably shared that view. And then it said, overall, it's an unappreciated gem for understanding antebellum materialism's role in challenging religious dogma, earning a solid 7 out of 10 for intellectual courage, despite its limitations. And at that, I sort of laughed out loud. I wasn't expecting that it was going to give me a numerical rating, like some kind of Rotten Tomatoes or something like that. But in any case, it did, and it gave me some reasons. It gave me a summary of the 448-page book, talked about Knowlton's definition of materialism, his ideas about utilitarianism, the future state, and happiness, his critique of religion and also of free will, because he was kind of a determinist, and then the social implications. And then it discussed the book's strengths and its weaknesses. And so it summarized by saying that this was a courageous manifesto for reason over revelation that would be valuable for historians of secularism, but would be also limited by its era's science and also by the limited reception that it had in its time. And I thought this was actually a fairly good summary and evaluation of modern materialism, which I, probably uniquely among historians working today, have actually read cover to cover. So from there, I went back to sort of easier questions. I asked it to give me a list of some books and articles that cite the very influential Albert Post book, Popular Free Thought in America. And it did that. It gave me several that I was aware of and a couple that I wasn't aware of, which again was interesting because I'm asking it questions about things that I know about at first to sort of test it and see if I'm going to get reasonable answers, if I'm going to get answers that I think can be defended as at least being potentially true rather than just blatant hallucinations. And so far, so good, I will say. So it gave me a bunch of titles. It gave me 29 web pages. So I've got a lot of material here that I can use. And then finally, the last thing that I did was ask it to summarize that entire conversation, beginning with my upload of the Knowlton biography for a potential podcast video script. And I asked it to do that in less than 1,500 words. And it thought about that for only 18 seconds. And I got to say, I'm not super enthusiastic about what it came up with. I think it did a fairly good job, kind of paragraph by paragraph in the interior of summarizing some of the things that we talked about. But the way that it framed it, I thought was a little bit cheesy. So I think Grok still has a little way to go as far as style goes. But in any case, I thought this was a really interesting hour or so that I spent this morning interacting with this application, with not the ultimate level of it, because I think there is one level above the one that I just subscribed to, which is probably only for and only affordable by people using it for business purposes. But I think that this was probably a fairly good test of what it can do, and I think it did pretty well. And so I am more confident now that I will be able to use it for helping me produce content, for example, for my courses, where I know what I want to say, but I want to make sure that I'm considering other perspectives and that I'm, in my enthusiasm for the things that I do want to cover, that I don't forget something that it's important to cover in a particular moment in time in a unit in one of my history classes. So I will probably be using it for that. And I've got to say, it was fun and it was interesting to interact with this application. So I hope you found it a little bit interesting as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again very soon.